I swear, if one more person asks me what I think about this update, I'm gonna lengthen this video because it probably does a better job of summarizing my thoughts rather than the raw scattered brain nonsense and Twitter limits I endure daily. I do not hate the new update by any means, but I knew from day one that the update wasn't for me. I had close to 6,969 intrinsics after the first 3 weeks of Railjack. If you're unaware, that means I can max another intrinsic tree after command. Even beyond that, I played Railjack for months to collect every single part as close to max valence level as possible. However, I found most of these things I could critique about the update aren't really about the update itself and more about design choices I find painfully stacking to frustration. If I focus on the update at its core, the update has more positive changes than necessarily negative. Take that how you will. In essence, I just felt that outside of some of the cost changes, Railjack is effectively left to where it was before the update. As for the entirety of my critique, the improved would be the Railjack layout change. There's a whole lot less wasted space, it's amazing. D-Rack being converted to Endo, very good unification. And then the plexus allowing individual customization was solid. You don't have to only rely on somebody's Railjack to progress. Yes, nice. In the more neutral section, I find the mission changes themselves are kind of hit or miss. You're effectively doing normal missions for Railjack reward tables, and it just feels like there's a significantly faster way to go about getting those parts, and it's kind of like avoiding the side objectives and endlessly murdering the ships that spawn. And this brings us to our next point, Tether and GIAN point. All right, I don't know if I should rip the band-aid off slowly or quickly. Let's just do it slowly. Tether was indeed overpowered, but I genuinely don't think I have the words to help people comprehend, but let's give it a shot. First, they changed Tether. Second, they gave us unlimited, essentially, and segregated energy pools. Third, they added diminishing returns. And fourth, they spread out enemy spawns. All this so players would be incentivized to use guns more than ability spam. And I can't think of a better analogy than that they're trying to make these changes with the expectation that players will put the circle block into the circle hole. But the reality is that they're only reinforcing the square hole yet again. If you ask someone, how would you kill a lot of enemies in unknown and scattered location with minimal effort in Railjack? Yeah, you'd probably want them to say something like coordination and gunplay, right? Well, guess what the reality is? And if you, as a designer, are looking at Seeker Volley with your Nerf gun, who cares? Unless players are farming new armaments or need to kill 2 cruise ships, there's literally no reason to bother with the Railjack combat at all when doing the Corpus missions. Not to mention, you still be missing the point. I can assure you, it won't actually change how certain players are addressing Railjack. It would only change the tools they use, and with 4 players and infinite energy, you'd basically be taking to battle each avionic one by one until we're right back to some combination of Tether and Void Hole being ideal again. The reason why I find the Tether and GIAN point changes so frustrating is because players are telling you there was something they like. Granted, you at least addressed it and attempted to incorporate it into all of the missions, but because you can't accomplish missions simultaneously, players end up running back to Grenier missions for efficiency. Players are also telling you things they dislike, like countermeasures. Why does it exist? Pilots get a maneuver that accomplishes missile evasion well enough. It feels like for too long there has been more focus on reallocating what players enjoy and not enough reallocating what players don't enjoy, at least from my personal perspective. And with that massive segment done, we'll try to get through the rest of as quickly as possible. Again, from my perspective, I'm just not utterly thrilled with some of the changes. Some of it comes from archaic design principles that seem to just continue as time goes on. LICH crewmates. I was gonna talk about how lackluster they were, but DevStream 158 gave a lot more insight, and I wish that dev workshops and streams were more of this, because I can't tell what part of the update is done. I had no indication that Lich's weren't finished due to animation constraints. The way Lich's roles were mentioned seemed like conviction, as if it was a concrete design choice. But yeah, guess we'll see what command becomes. Alright, Gunner 10 and Gunners in general, I do not like the Gunner role. I feel like the double edge on Gunner 10 is unnecessary, as none of the other roles come with such a design. Not to mention, if anyone bothers using a gun, it takes a second to traverse closer to the enemy and mow them down. It really feels like Gunners need some sort of eject Railjack to archwing option to smooth out their gameplay. Right now, you're better off having somebody glued into the artillery seat because that's the only place the pilot struggles. Heaven forbid, if the artillery cannon doubled as a turret, the other two ports would be obsolete. With all that in mind, I found the reason the gunner role bothers me so much is because it's an abstraction of suspended archwing instead of just being suspended archwing. And that concept ties a bit into unified damage and Railjack armaments, but the unified damage types aren't that impactful because first off, the damage type effects were not 1-to-1. Particle was closer to viral than it was to actually slash. Secondly, we cannot mod our damage types, and that all brings us to Railjack guns overall. Like DE, I 100% understand design constraints and limits to team size, but with all those things in mind, I cannot help but wonder why the Railjack guns were not just arc guns. You've already got the code and systems in place for those. You could have expanded on the quantity a bit more, but ultimately players have already invested in guns and have mods that would have sufficed instead of the isolated drops and RNG of Railjack guns that won't see the light of day in these new missions that seem to not even require players to shoot. That ties into the gunner and suspended archwing concept as well. Again, we have several battle avionics that could have sufficed or already paralleled to existing archwing abilities. For example, if you say players are allowed to use archwing abilities in the pilot or gunner seat and include modular archwing in this patch, you reward players who have already progressed in archwing, or alternatively, I suppose, you could salvage the battle and tactical avionics and just make them options in modular archwing. Okay, a bit of an aside, do you really think people buy Prime Access because it's difficult to crack relics? Here we go again. You have the power at your fingertips and are just not using it. It's honestly like watching someone take an open book test, but they don't open the book even for answers they're unsure of. Why not just make a survey? Because I'd argue relics are easier than keys were, and I was of the impression that most people bought Prime Access to support the game that cared about their voice. Just hear me out. From buying one Prime Access, you'd have so much plat that you'd not even have to bother with it anymore. Have you seen the price of Octavia Prime? It drops like after the first week, and you get all that gear for about 200 of your 4,000 plat. You could sell a few unveiled ribbons, syndicate gear, or prime mods to afford that if relics were really, quote, that difficult to farm. Do you get this? Okay, now back on to the reactor changes. So before this update, players were chasing after VDAR reactors because at that point, the avionics capacity was like the most important, and flux energy, you had a mod to increase it, all right? Okay, and then this update comes along only for it to add stats that players cannot control and incentivize Z-key reactors. Players spent hours grinding for reactors, and suddenly it's like, yeah, by the way, the reactor you got now, it just really isn't that great. Go farm another one. That's just like a further pain point, and I can't, why? Granted, I had one of each reactor, so it didn't really bother me, but yeah, it's still kind of weird. Now a little note about the new plating. VDAR and Z-key are so close to identical, like there's not such a significant difference that you would necessarily need to choose one or the other. Z-key has like 1.3 less % DR and about 600 more hull. Like there's no real sway there. And then you look at Levon, which is supposed to be the exact opposite of VDAR, I suppose, and you only really lose like 1.9% damage reduction, but you gain over 2,000 hull. There's no real choice here. You pick Levon at max valence transfer and you win net over the other two. It just really feels like it's more of a pseudo choice. Like, here are 3 houses because we have things with 3 houses instead of making them actually matter. Oh Lord. The volatile game mode. Lord, what I wouldn't give for the volatile game mode to be some type of law of retribution bomb carrying sabotage mission that just got increasingly complex like a progressive series of spy vault speedruns instead of the pipe staring simulator that it is now. That's all, folks. Hopefully you found this discussion interesting. Did you find yourself in agreement or disagreement with the concepts I mentioned? Feel free to bap that subscribe button or follow on Twitch if you are interested in more design critique and or discussion.